McCarthyism, which should be seen more so as a subsect of the Red Scare that specifically focuses on trying to root out Soviet spies and any ground they may have made in US politics and the economy. Attributed mainly to McCarthy, though he was by no means the only agent in this. His efforts were largely based on dubious efforts, and it is described today as a witch hunt, becoming a synonym for the word even.
All the same, it's important to consider that the semantic of a Red Scare not only focuses on the application and the witch hunt associated with McCarthy and the US domestic politics. It's also important to consider on February 22nd, George Kennan, the US ambassador to the Soviet Union, sent a telegram to his new president, Truman, announcing the urgency and the imminent danger of the communist pandemic. Kennan said, "At the bottom of the Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is a traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. For this reason, they have always feared foreign penetration, feared direct contact between the Western world and their own, feared what would happen if Russians learned the truth about the world without, or if foreigners learned the truth about the world within." Kennan also described that world communism is like a malignant parasite which feeds only on diseased tissue.
What was the European reaction to this? Because of course the West wasn't only the USA, even if they were the broader hegemonic power.
Well, the European countries in particular had received a lot of funding through the Marshall Plan, and they felt obligated to conform to US political ideologies. And in this case, Kennan, who had given this address again in 1947 to the House of Representatives, he'd broadcast this idea of containment of communism and that it was the duty and obligation of the Western world to ensure the capitalist ideology prevailed.
I see.
But also, it wasn't just American politicians that really pushed this idea of containing communism and fearing its spread. United Kingdom's Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered a televised speech to the members of Westminster College, Fulton, Missouri. He said that from Stettin to the Baltic, from Trieste to the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. This was Winston Churchill's Sinews of Peace speech, given in 1946. Though he was just given the accolades of a wartime hero, his mindset was already focused on an incoming enemy from the East, the Soviet Union and its communist empire. He set the precedent that the Western world should fear the infiltration of communist espionage and spies. He genuinely feared that there would be a takeover of the Western world had the security measures of the United States and its allies not engaged immediately.
Did your research ever lead you to find out whether there was any major Soviet spy activity?
So not necessarily Soviet spy activity, but definitely Soviet activity in territories considered Western or perhaps considered capitalist and safe for the United States. There was a growing concern that those places might be taken over. So in particular, Mao Zedong's takeover of China on October 1st, 1949, really marked the closeness in proximity to communism from a United States perspective, literally just across the ocean. And it also pointed out that important figures or social norms like Chiang Kai-shek's leadership of the country, those sovereignties didn't necessarily stand. Communism was still going to attack and take over these sacred ideas.
I mean, it all sounds quite sensationalist, honestly. Do you think there was this is more of an opinion, but do you think there was more? Do you think there was an actual threat that the communist regime posed to the West, or was it sort of them fearing being knocked out of power?
There's definitely a existential threat from a political perspective.
Yeah.
Andrei Zadanov, was the leader of propaganda for the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And he prolifically emphasized the existence of two polarized camps, and these were capitalism and communism. So even from a Soviet perspective, there was a war being waged in this political landscape, although there was no real tangible evidence of it until conflicts broke loose, which didn't necessarily happen by the powers themselves, but by proxy. And in particular, American policymaker John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State to the USA under Truman, believed that the only way that the conflict would be resolved was through brinkmanship, bringing your enemy to the absolute brink of their capabilities, scaring them to a point that there was no longer an option of existential safety, that the conflict must end, otherwise there will be a sore loser.
I see. Well, my research was more so limited to McCarthy himself, because I do feel like even though he was by no means like more major than the Red Scare himself, I do feel like he was quite a big facet of it as a representation of the America's actions of purging like internal left-wing conflict rather than sort of its actions externally. Now, the most direct and devastating impact of McCarthyism was, of course, on the individuals accused of having communist sympathies. Thousands of Americans, from government employees to artists, educators, union leaders, they were all investigated by congressional committees, such as the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC. And these accusations were, as I said earlier, based on dubious evidence or mere association with someone else that may have leanings. And the hearings, often public, garnered quite a large amount of humiliation for whoever was being accused. This McCarthy's overzealous nature, in this sense, was made prudent in 1950 when he accused over 200 members of the State Department of having communist sympathies, something that he quickly backtracked and changed to only 81, of which he only really leveled direct accusations against 9 people, most of whom did not actually work in the State Department to begin with. And it is moments like these which lend heavy credence to the notion that the US was way too overzealous on who it deemed a communist sympathizer. And I posit the notion that it was more so an effort to purge the left-wing movement that was growing in America at the time, because after the First World War, it was sort of seen as trendy in academic circles even to sort of have communist leanings, or at least engage with communist viewpoints. Now, he didn't really stop at state members either. Of course, a highlight of McCarthyism in general is that many he accused faced professional ruin, and this was especially prudent in Hollywood. The Hollywood 10 and others were blacklisted, effectively ending their careers. And a similar fate befell many academics and journalists who wrote from a actual left-wing perspective. And this sort of caused many filmmakers and academics and scholars who may have those opinions to hide their views, and it led to a very focused anti-communist media sentiment in general, which I think was very devastating, considering that America's greatest cultural export is probably, one, its conservative nature, and two, this conservative nature which is fermented through sort of its media, right? And I mean, case in point, post Second World War, a vast majority of people would have said that the Soviet Union was the major cause of defeat for Nazi Germany, whereas nowadays, I believe many polls show that in the West, anyways, that the sentiment is the USA or the UK had a much bigger impact against Nazi Germany than the Soviet Union did.
So do you believe that the use of the legal medium in these witch hunt trials was merely an excuse to create a loophole within the legal system whereby you could accuse an opponent of doing anything communist and oust the remaining enemies you have as a politician?
Oh, definitely. In fact, like most people who were accused weren't even accused based on having communist sympathies. They were just, they were. The entire thing with having communist sympathies is that you'd be a state risk or state security risk. But most people who were accused of being a security risk never even had communist sympathies. They were accused on the basis that they were homosexual, which was famously sort of a movement started by McCarthy himself, right? When he did the famous Lavender Scare. Now, it really would be remiss to discuss McCarthyism and like the broader Red Scare without mentioning this, because it was just like a really veritable witch hunt against homosexual men and women. And it was viewed very seriously by supporters of McCarthyism at the time. People like Senator Kenneth Wherry even questioned on like Senate floor debates whether you can think of a person who could be more dangerous than a pervert, which referred to a homosexual person back then. Now, given that both the weight of this movement and the fact that, as I said, most people who were dismissed on the grounds of being a security risk were not those with communist sympathies, it's quite surprising because the Lavender Scare isn't really talked of as a main focal point. It's more so talked of like as a footnote of sort of McCarthy's legacy or the broader Red Scare in general, as David Johnson argues in his book on the subject. And it's interesting as well because you said that the legal medium was more so used to sort of like accuse anyone who may have opposition. McCarthy himself had to sort of like distance himself after the 1950s from this mode of attack because a lot of the allegations that he made a lot of the qualities of a known homosexual, as it was said back then, could also be applied to him, as David Johnson argues. And this like backtracking sort of drew a lot of detraction from the Republican Party, who really sort of like got on him and said that he should have been going harder on like carrying out the Lavender Scare. And it's interesting because to me, it shows that McCarthy was more so like a lens through which the Republicans could focus their moral panic, as their hatred didn't really lessen throughout the Cold War and indeed today's times either.
Well, it's interesting you should say that because two of the biggest prosecutions by the House of Un-American Activities were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and Olga Hiss. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted on the grounds that David Greenglass, Ethel's brother, had admitted to receiving nuclear documents from Julius Rosenberg, who was a member of the Manhattan Project. These accusations held great credence because the Soviet Union tested their first atomic bomb in 1949, 4 years after the alleged documents changed hands. And so there was a real element of proof to this espionage and spying from the Soviet Union. Consequently, both he and his wife were convicted and eventually executed for this very traitorous crime. And this is an example of a case that had a lot of weight behind it, and McCarthy could really use to emphasize the point of...
Even the Pope tried to stop McCarthy from executing these two, right?
Yes, that's true. So it was a very sort of polarized issue in the sense that this was going to be the make or break, the precedent that sets either communism is getting completely expunged or this argument of communism is everywhere doesn't necessarily have as much weight as everybody first intended. And Olga is definitely an example of this. He was a government lawyer, a member of the State Department, and was once at a time the General Secretary of the United Nations. This immense power that he had obviously made him a target for the House of Un-American Activities. He was under great scrutiny, and eventually that scrutiny broke when Whittaker Chambers, a journalist associated with HIS, came out and said that he was a member of the Communist Party and that he had exchanged documents in exchange for political safety within the Soviet Union or protection. So the House of Un-American Activities, headed by their prosecution, Richard Nixon, found that he would have a sentence of 5 years for a case of perjury. So he lied in a previous jury. So they couldn't get him on the grounds that they initially wanted him on, this traitorous espionage. So instead, they attacked him for a much lesser charge, which really just showed the ruthlessness and kind of backstabbing nature of the House of Un-American Activities. And initially, the Parliament was hung, and there was no conviction. But in 1950, he was sentenced to that outgoing crime of perjury and given 5 years.
The HUAC was disbanded, right, after Nixon.
Yes, so ironically, Richard Nixon, who we all know for being a famously good sport, once he left office, it was disbanded under Gerald Ford in 1974. So that was really the focal point of people seeing the terror invoked by the Red Scare. But McCarthy's career and the Red Scare, by this same merit, was very short-lived.
I mean, moving away from America for this last point, I recently came across a video which described the horrendous media blackout surrounding a ongoing genocide of the tribes people of West Papua conducted by a joint US-Australia-backed Indonesia, and how America's efforts to completely suppress any communist activity across the globe during the 1960s and 70s as part of the Cold War led to the CIA operating in Indonesia to supplant the socialist government, at the time the third largest left-wing government in the world, and aided the rival political party, who led a incredible massacre which killed 500,000 supporters of the Socialist Party and imprisoned a further million. Now, this was one of the most successful CIA operations in history, and it relates entirely with the USA the Cold War, because of how sort of their actions paved the way for the dictatorship that came after the supplanting of the Indonesian government, and how their anti-communist stance was sort of like embedded into the not necessarily the people of Indonesia, but the government of Indonesia, and how the Indonesian government's interests were now aligned with the US government, and so they carry out this genocide in West Papua.
A little bit like Pinochet in Chile.
Exactly. And in fact, there's very little news coverage because they censor it. In fact, I believe a reporter named Carlson was executed a couple of years back when he tried to enter West Papua. And it was written off as a suicide, even that he managed to decapitate himself somehow. But yeah. And it all just ties back into the idea of how America's actions have a lasting influence on today.
So it's clear that the Red Scare is a global affair.
Exactly.